This is the AMD Radeon RX 5500 XT, a card that completely impressed us in a recent video, and I thought today, what better than to compare it with than the card that was to replace it, the RX 6500 XT. Now, in a recent video, we took a look at the AMD Radeon RX 5500 XT, and this card actually really impressed us. It was one of the cards that we missed from the 5000 series, so we were doing a bit of a catch-up just to see how well it would perform today, and it performed exceptionally well. It did struggle a little bit in some of those more newer titles, but I believe that the 8GB of VRAM on this card actually helped it just jump above some of the other cards that we've been testing. I was so impressed with this card that I thought, what could we actually compare it to? Should we compare it to something a little bit older? Should we compare it to something a bit newer? And then I remembered that we actually do have an RX 6500 XT in inventory, and I thought, what better than to compare them to see if people actually got a decent upgrade. Now today we're going to jump straight into some benchmarks, but before we do that, let's take a look at some of the stats of these cards on paper just to see how kind of well they compare together. The RX 5500 XT is running on a GPU of a Navi 14, whereas the RX 6500 XT is on a Navi 24. The interfaces for the RX 5500 XT is a PCI Gen 4x8, which is actually really helping this card along, specifically when it comes to the comparison between the 6500 XT, which is running on a PCI Gen 4x4. Now that is one of the biggest mistakes that AMD made when it came to the RX 6500 XT. They did limit the memory on this, and we'll get to the memory in a minute, but they actually did a lot of sacrificing when it came to the PCI Gen that it actually runs through. Being a PCI Gen 4x4 and having a low memory bandwidth meant that this card really struggled even when it was released. I know when we actually picked this card up, we actually picked it up for about £90 when they were running for about £180, which was an absolute bargain at the time, because for £90 I think the card was actually worth it, but for the retail price that it had, it just really wasn't. The performance wasn't there, particularly when AMD had to compare it to even their really older generations like the RX 470 and the RX 570 to even get it to look pretty good on a chart. Aside from those specs though, when we actually look a bit further, the RX 6500 XT obviously outperforms the 5500 XT when it comes to boost clock speeds, having a boost clock speed of 2815 compared to the RX 5500 XT's 1845. It also has a higher game clock speed of 2610 MHz, but then we kind of hit the shaders where we have a bit of a drop. The RX 6500 XT has a shader count of 1024 compared to the RX 5500 XT's 1408. Now when it comes to the memory, the RX 6500 XT does come with 4GB of GDDR6 compared to the RX 5500 XT's 8GB. And then of course the RX 6500 XT also has a lower power consumption of only 107 watts compared to the RX 5500 XT's 130. Now the RX 6500 XT was released in 2022, so it actually had 2 years on the 5500 XT, and as we can tell from the specs just on paper alone, it's not actually that impressive. It is a more efficient card, but when we look at the sacrifices AMD made to its memory count, to the PCIe Gen and compatibility, I can actually see that it will struggle quite a bit, and to be honest, that's exactly what we saw in our testing. So we put both of these cards into our testing rig, and we gave them an identical test for test against our normal test suite. Now that test suite is made up of some reasonably newer games, some older games, and particularly some really quite modern games from 2023. And I don't think the results will shock you, but let's take a look at those benchmarks anyway, and then we'll discuss what kind of issues we had and what we kind of saw. Now the benchmarks we had for these cards were actually quite weird. We did actually expect the RX 6500 XT just to kind of slightly outperform the 5500 XT, being that it's a new generation of RDNA and stuff, but to be honest, it was a bit of a mixed bag of results. The best scores for both cards were obviously within the 1080p range, so let's take a look at those results. When it came to 1080p with a high preset, in Back 4 Blood, the RX 6500 XT did actually manage to outperform the 5500 XT just by a little smidge. It's about 20 frames per second, but that's actually fantastic, and the kind of thing that we expected from the newer generation. The issue here though is that Back 4 Blood is not a very memory intensive game, so maybe the memory and the PCIe configuration didn't really come into it. In Cyberpunk 2077, the RX 6500 XT was outperformed by its older brother by about 10 frames per second again, with the 6500 XT getting 30 frames per second on average, and the 5500 XT getting 38. Doom Eternal was a really big shock to us because the RX 5500 XT really did outperform the 6500 XT by a lot, getting nearly double the frames per second, and no matter what we did, we just could not squeeze any more out of the 6500 XT. That is a real shame because that game generally runs really well on everything, and I'm not really sure what was going on with the card, but it just couldn't push past that 65 frames per second, no matter what we kind of did to it. I was quite shocked by the results of God of War on both cards, with the 5500 XT getting an average of 59 frames per second, and the 6500 XT getting an average of 53. That meant that the game was pretty playable, but we've got a few more notes on God of War in a minute. Red Dead Redemption 2, being one of the oldest games in our test suite, actually performed pretty well on both cards, getting an average of 68 frames per second for the 5500 XT, and an average of 62 frames per second for the 6500 XT, meaning the game was pretty playable and it was actually a pretty smooth gameplay experience. Spider-Man Remastered was another example of where the older 5500 XT actually took away from the 6500 XT, getting an average of 68 frames per second compared to its replacement getting only 43. Now The Last of Us Part 1 is very testing on pretty much most hardware, and the results here we kind of expected really. Many would say that these are actually unplayable, but the 5500 XT managed to get a pretty reasonable 35 frames per second compared to the 6500 XTs, which only got 31. Now these cards are not 1440p cards, but we did do some 1440p testing because we only thought it was fair, as we did it on the 5500 XT in the recent video. And to be honest, the results here were even worse. When it came to Back 4 Blood, both cards managed to get over an average of 60 frames per second, which was pretty good. In Cyberpunk 2077, the gap actually widened here, with the RX 5500 XT getting a big lead of 23 frames per second compared to the 6500 XT's 12 frames per second, which kind of just meant the game was completely unplayable. Doom Eternal was an odd one here because the 5500 XT performed exceptionally well, getting an average of 87 frames per second, but with the identical settings, 1440p with a high preset, the RX 6500 XT just wouldn't work. God of War performed exceptionally well on both, even in 1440p, getting an average of 40 for the 5500 XT and an average of 37 for the 6500 XT. Red Dead Redemption 2 again performed reasonably well for the 5500 XT, getting an average of 30. Some people would say that's playable, but then we get to the 6500 XT and it really did lag behind, with only getting an average of 20 frames per second. Spider-Man Remastered again performing exceptionally well on the 5500 XT, managing to get an average of 49 frames per second. That meant that the game was really playable and pretty smooth, particularly on an older RDNA card. But then for the 6500 XT, there was actually quite a bit of a drop, all the way down to 35 frames per second. Again, some people would say that's playable, but in the wider range of things, it's actually not an upgrade at all. As expected, The Last of Us Part 1 was actually pretty unplayable on both cards, with the 5500 XT getting an average of 26 frames per second, and the 6500 XT getting an average of only 17. Now, of course, these cards are not 1440p cards, but we did the testing anyway, just to see what they would actually do, and to be honest, the only real issues came with the 6500 XT, which is quite shocking being that it is the later generation card. When it came to Doom Eternal, we just couldn't get it to run, and that was because we just kept getting VRAM warnings. So obviously, if the 5500 XT was a 4GB card, which they did make back in the day, that one would have got the issues too, so we can't really compare like for like there, but that game did require more than 4GB of VRAM, particularly when running in a 1440p high setting. To actually get that to work, you just needed to drop some settings so you could play Doom Eternal in 1440p with an RX 6500 XT and its low count of 4GB of VRAM. But you'd probably be better just dropping the resolution to 1080p and cranking those settings up, and the card worked perfectly fine. You would actually get over an average of 60 frames per second, but then that's the kind of thing you would be expecting for this type of card, particularly with its limitations. One game though that actually performed really poorly on both cards, particularly the 6500 XT, was of course The Last of Us Part 1, but that game differed to Doom Eternal because it would actually still let you run the game. So we actually tried that testing, and of course we got around 17 frames per second. So we decided to change some settings, do some tweaks and see what we could actually get out of this card. Lowering the resolution to 1080p would of course got us an average of 30 frames per second, just as we mentioned before, but we wanted more, so we lowered the preset down to low and we enabled FSR 2.1 to a balanced setting. Now that meant that the game was actually more than playable. It was reasonably smooth and you could actually play the game perfectly fine, but to be honest, the sacrifice made to the graphical fidelity just wasn't worth it for us. Doing a comparison shot against 1440p high and our custom configuration to get it to play smoothly, you can clearly see that there's a lot of issues when it comes to how well the game looks. Now that does mean that you can actually play the game with low settings, but would you really want to? You're kind of going to miss out on a lot of the game. And that kind of brings us to the conclusion of our video. With a few tweaks to settings, you can get both these cards to actually play the games, but on most of the games, what we found is the 5500 XT actually outperformed the 6500 XT pretty much every time. That is a real shame because that means that there is no clear upgrade here for anybody on a budget. And considering that the 5500 XT was actually $180 when it was released, and so was the RX 6500 XT, it actually means that there's a bit of a shame around this card. You probably should avoid one of these if you can pick up one of these, because these are actually way cheaper now. But let me know in the comments below what you think of these two cards. Do you own either of these cards and what kind of performance are you getting? Were you somebody that actually did try to do that upgrade and found out very quickly that it wasn't an upgrade at all? But that's it really. A bit of a disappointment for the RX 6500 XT. We will keep it around. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and I'm sure we'll catch you in the next one.